Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really pivotal moment in American history.
We are indeed. We're looking at American imperialism, specifically that period from about 1890 up to 1913.
Yeah, and our sources, mostly these excerpts from '06 Imperialism, 1888 to 1913, they show this huge shift, don't they? Moving away from just focusing on the continent.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental change in foreign policy. Before this, it was mostly about manifest destiny settling North America. But now you see the U.S. looking overseas for influence, for territory even.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really dig into why this happened.
Yeah.
What were the drivers, and what were the consequences?
Exactly. What pushed the U.S. onto the world stage in this new way?
Okay, let's start with those causes. The source mentions something pretty specific. The 1890 census report. The superintendent declared the frontier closed.
Right. And that sounds maybe a bit bureaucratic, but it had this massive psychological impact. The idea of endless westward expansion suddenly gone.
So people fell hemmed in. Like the country needed new outlets.
Sort of, yeah. You had a growing population, industries booming, more wealth, but also this feeling that, well, maybe we need more resources, more space. There were even feels about running out of stuff here at home.
And the economy wasn't exactly stable either. The Panic of 1893 pops up in the source.
A huge factor. That depression fueled fears of overproduction, that American factories were making more than Americans could actually buy.
Which leads directly to the idea of needing foreign markets, right?
Mm.
A safety valve, as the source puts it.
Precisely, sell the surplus abroad. Plus, you had labor unrest at home, the populist movement. Some saw overseas markets as a way to distract from domestic problems.
It's mentioned, too, and it's a tough point, that the way the U.S. had dealt with Native American tribes, well, that experience provided a model for controlling other peoples.
A very sobering parallel, yes. How to exert colonial control.
In just the raw economics, foreign trade was becoming much more important overall.
Definitely. More trade meant more prosperity, or so the thinking went. And colonies seemed like the best way to guarantee access to those foreign markets and raw materials.
But this wasn't happening in a vacuum, was it? Europe was deep into empire building.
Oh, absolutely. The source really stresses this competition. Britain, France, Germany, they were carving up Africa and Asia. Between 1870 and 1900, they grabbed vast amounts of land.
So there was pressure for the U.S. to keep up, to claim its place as a world power.
For an influential group, yes, they wanted that international status. Germany, in particular, is highlighted as a rival pushing into areas the U.S. was eyeing.
Okay, so it's this mix. Economic need, this sort of closing frontier anxiety, and straight-up geopolitical competition.
That's a good way to put it. And then you layer on the people actively arguing for expansion. Thinkers, writers, politicians.
Like Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. That seems crucial.
Absolutely fundamental. Published in 1890, Mahan's argument was pretty straightforward. Control the seas, you dominate the world.
Which meant
A big modern navy, steel ships. You needed overseas bases, coaling stations. He specifically points to Hawaii, and critically, a canal through Central America.
that really set the agenda, didn't it? It fueled a naval race.
It did. And the yellow press, the newspapers, they picked up on it too. By 1900, the U.S. actually had the world's third largest navy.
Then there are others mentioned, like Josiah Strong, his book, Our Country.
Yeah, Strong brought in this religious and racial dimension. He argued for the superiority of Anglo-Saxon civilization, the need to spread Protestantism and American democratic values, a sort of divine mission.
A pretty potent justification. And Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge get mentioned too, applying social Darwinism.
Right. The idea of survival of the fittest, but applied to nations. They argued the U.S. had to become an imperial power just to survive in this competitive world. Senator Albert Beveridge was even more explicit, talking about a superior race ordained by God.
Wow. And on top of all that, the power of the press, Pulitzer and Hearst's yellow journalism.
You can't underestimate that. Stirring up public interest, sometimes manufacturing outrage about things happening overseas, it created a climate where expansion seemed exciting, even necessary.
So before they started grabbing territory outright, there were other moves, like James G. Blaine's Pan-Americanism. What was that about?
Blaine's Big Sister policy, as it was called. The idea was to get Latin American nations under the U.S. wing, essentially. Open up their markets, get them to follow the U.S. lead.
Established dominance in the hemisphere.
Pretty much. He organized the first Pan American Conference in 1889, but it didn't totally work out as planned.
Why not?
Well, the Latin American countries were pretty wary. They worried about U.S. dominance, about being pushed around. They didn't go for his big ideas like a customs union.
Understandable concerns.
But it did open the door for more talks later on, and you see other early signs of the U.S. flexing its muscles, like the Samoan crisis.
Ah, Pago, Pago. That was a near miss with Germany, wasn't it? Over Samoa.
Almost came to blows between the navies in 1889. Eventually settled by treaty, and the U.S. got American Samoa, including that key harbor at Pago Pago. So the pieces were moving even before 1898.
Okay, that sets the stage. Let's get into the major events. The Venezuela boundary dispute, mid-1890s.
Right. This old border dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana suddenly got hot because somebody found gold.
Gold always complicates things.
Doesn't it just? President Cleveland stepped in forcefully. He invoked the Monroe Doctrine, basically telling Europe, stay out of the Americas. He demanded Britain submit the dispute to arbitration.
That was a bold move against the British Empire.
It really was. Britain initially pushed back, questioned the Monroe Doctrine itself, but they had other problems.
Like what?
Well, the source mentions the looming Boer War in South Africa, worries about Canada, their merchant ships, and, crucially, the rising power of the German Navy, who had bigger fish to fry, essentially.
So they eventually agreed to arbitration.
They did. And this was a huge win for the U.S. It boosted the Monroe Doctrine's credibility, Latin America liked it, and surprisingly, it actually led to better relations between the U.S. and Britain, the Great Rapprochement.
Interesting outcome. Okay, let's shift to the Pacific. Hawaii. American interest there went way back, right?
Decades.
Yeah.
Missionaries, traders, sugar planters. But the McKinley Tariff of 1890 really shook things up.
How so?
It put high duties on imported sugar, hitting the Hawaiian sugar planters hard. Suddenly, annexation by the U.S. looked very appealing to them. They wouldn't have to pay the tariff.
But the Hawaiian monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, wasn't keen on that.
Not at all. She was a nationalist trying to resist American influence. This led to a showdown in 1893. White planters, led by Sanford Dole, revolted.
And the U.S. military got involved?
Controversially, yes. U.S. troops landed, supposedly to protect American lives, but it definitely helped the revolt succeed. The U.S. minister there, John Stevens, even sent that infamous message, "The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe."
And this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it.
Ooh. Yeah. A treaty annexing Hawaii was rushed to Washington. But President Cleveland, who was back in office, hit the brakes.
He refused to annex. Why?
He investigated and found that most Native Hawaiians were strongly against annexation. He felt the whole revolt was illegitimate. He couldn't restore the Queen, but he wouldn't annex.
So the planters just declared a republic?
The Republic of Hawaii, with Dole as president, yeah. Annexation stalled until the Spanish-American War in 1898. Then, suddenly, Hawaii seemed strategically vital.
As a coaling station for the Navy heading to the Philippines.
Exactly. So it was finally annexed then. But that whole episode sparked the first really big national debate in the U.S. about whether becoming an empire was the right thing to do.
A debate that was about to get much louder with Cuba.
Oh, absolutely. The Spanish-American War in 1898. And the yellow press was right in the thick of it.
Sensational stories about Spanish atrocities against Cuban rebels. Often exaggerated, sometimes just made up.
Often, yes. Plus, the economic hit Cuba took from U.S. tariffs on sugar hurt American plantation owners there, too. And then Spain's reconcentration policy.
Forcing civilians into camps.
Yes, under General Weyler, Butcher Weyler, the papers called him. Conditions were horrific. Thousands died. It really fueled American outrage.
Cleveland stayed neutral, but McKinley took a harder line.
He did. Spain actually made some concessions, they recalled Weyler, ended reconcentration, but things kept escalating. First, the Delome letter.
The Spanish ambassador criticizing McKinley in a private letter that got leaked.
Made McKinley look weak, angered Americans, and then the big one, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, February 1898.
Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain.
Became the instant rallying cry. Even though we now know an internal explosion was likely the cause, at the time, everyone blamed Spain. The press went wild. Hearst allegedly told his illustrator, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war."
Did McKinley want war?
Initially, he and Wall Street were hesitant. War disrupts business. But the public pressure, fueled by the press and pressure from within the Republican Party, became overwhelming.
So war was declared in April 1898, and they added the Teller Amendment.
Yes, promising the U.S. wouldn't annex Cuba. A gesture towards anti-imperialist sentiment, though many abroad were skeptical.
The war itself was quick.
Remarkably so. Commodore Dewey crushed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in the Philippines almost immediately. That attack was pre-planned by Theodore Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of Navy then.
And Hawaii got annexed right in the middle of all this, July 98.
The strategic logic seemed undeniable at that point. Then came the land campaigns. U.S. troops landed in Cuba.
Roosevelt's Rough Riders got a lot of press.
They did, though the contribution of experienced black regiments was crucial at battles like San Juan Hill. U.S. forces also took Puerto Rico fairly easily. The Spanish Caribbean fleet was destroyed, and Spain asked for peace in August.
Leading to the Treaty of Paris.
Signed in December 98. Cuba gained independence, technically. The U.S. got Guam and Puerto Rico outright. And then the real sticking point, the Philippines.
The U.S. bought them from Spain for $20 million.
Yes. McKinley apparently agonized over it, even claimed divine guidance told him to take them. This decision absolutely ignited the imperialism debate back home.
What were the arguments for taking the Philippines?
Well, strategic locations stepping stone to China markets, missionary zeal uplifting and Christianizing the Filipinos, even though many were already Catholic, business interests, new markets, raw materials, that sort of paternalistic white man's burden idea.
And the arguments against?
The anti-imperialists.
A real mix of people. Some feared getting entangled in foreign problems. Others worried about cheap labor competition, the cost of big military. Some raised concerns about racial mixing. And fundamentally, many argued it violated the American principle of consent of the governed, just like Britain had violated the colonies' rights. They pointed right back to the Declaration of Independence.
A powerful argument, yet the treaty passed the Senate. Narrowly. William Jennings Bryan, a leading Democrat and anti-imperialist, surprisingly urged Democrats to vote for it. His strategy was basically end the war, then make the Republicans own the consequences of imperialism in the next election.
Interesting tactic. What about the legal status of these new places, Puerto Rico, the Philippines?
That went to the Supreme Court in the insular cases around 1901. The ruling was basically that the Constitution does not automatically follow the flag. People in these territories didn't automatically get full constitutional rights.
So they were possessions, not future states with equal rights. What about Cuba? The Teller Amendment promised independence.
The U.S. military did withdraw in 1902. General Leonard Wood had overseen improvements in sanitation, education. Walter Reed did his famous work on yellow fever there. But independence came with a major catch.
The Platt Amendment.
Exactly. Cuba was forced to write it into its own constitution. It limited Cuba's ability to make treaties, handle its finances, and crucially gave the U.S. the right to intervene whenever it saw fit. And it granted the U.S. naval bases, including Guantanamo Bay.
So independence was pretty heavily qualified.
You could say that. It ensured U.S. dominance continued.
Okay, stepping back. The Spanish-American War, this splendid little war, as John Hay called it, it really boosted American nationalism, didn't it?
Immensely. The U.S. suddenly had an overseas empire. Modest compared to Britain or France, but still an empire. European powers took notice, showed more respect. Latin America, though,
Became more suspicious.
definitely. The Colossus of the North looked a lot more imposing. Britain started seeing the U.S. more as an ally, while Germany grew more wary.
And the Philippines specifically drew the U.S. much deeper into Asian politics.
For better or worse, yes. Mahan's ideas about naval power were clearly vindicated in many eyes, leading to more shipbuilding. Elihu Root made important reforms at the War Department, and it even helped heal some North-South divisions fighting a common enemy.
But it wasn't smooth sailing in the Philippines itself.
Far from it. The Filipinos had expected independence after Spain was defeated. When the U.S. decided to stay, a brutal insurrection broke out, led by Emilio Aguinaldo.
This is a much tougher fight than the war with Spain.
Much longer, much bloodier, years of fierce guerrilla warfare. Both sides committed atrocities. It cost thousands of lives, American and Filipino, and reignited the anti-imperialist protests back home.
How did it end?
Aguinaldo was finally captured in 1901. The U.S. set up a civilian government under William Howard Taft, the Taft Commission, and started implementing reforms. But full independence wouldn't come until 1946.
Meanwhile, in China, the U.S. was pushing the open-door policy.
Right. Secretary of State John Hay was worried the European powers and Japan would carve China up into exclusive economic zones, shutting out American businesses.
So the open-door node called for what exactly?
Basically, respect China's integrity and allow fair trade competition within everyone's sphere of influence. It sounded good, but was hard to enforce.
Then the Boxer Rebellion happened in 1900.
A nationalist uprising against all foreign influence in China. An international force, including U.S. soldiers, marched to Beijing and put it down.
And the U.S. did something unusual with the indemnity money China had to pay.
Yes, they later returned part of it on the condition it be used to educate Chinese students in the U.S. A smart diplomatic move, building goodwill. Hay also issued a second open-door note emphasizing China's territorial integrity.
Okay, let's fast forward slightly. The election of 1900.
McKinley won re-election easily. The slogan was pretty much prosperity, the gold standard, and hey, we won a war and got an empire. Theodore Roosevelt was his vice president.
And then McKinley was assassinated just months later in 1901.
Which put Roosevelt in the White House.
Right.
And that really marks a shift. TR was much more overtly assertive on the world stage. Speak softly but carry a big stick was his motto.
And the big stick often meant the Navy. And the Panama Canal Project really takes off under him.
Absolutely. The Spanish-American War showed how badly a canal was needed. Ships had to sail all the way around South America. First, they had to get around an old treaty with Britain, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty.
Replaced by the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, allowing the U.S. to build and control a canal.
Right. Then they tried to negotiate with Colombia, which controlled Panama at the time. But Colombia rejected the U.S. offer.
So Roosevelt encouraged a revolution in Panama.
That's putting it mildly. U.S. warships conveniently showed up, preventing Colombia from stopping the Panamanian uprising. The U.S. immediately recognized the new Republic of Panama and signed a treaty giving them control over the canal zone in perpetuity.
That sounds like gunboat diplomacy.
It was textbook Roosevelt, highly controversial. He later basically bragged, I took the canal. It created a lot of resentment in Latin America.
The canal got built.
Yeah.
Huge engineering feat.
Monumental. Finished in 1914. Colonel Gothal's on engineering, Colonel Gorgas on sanitation, fighting malaria and yellow fever, a massive strategic and commercial asset for the U.S.
Roosevelt also added his own twist to the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary.
Yes. This essentially said, if Latin American countries got into financial trouble, the U.S. had the right to step in, manage their finances, and prevent European powers from intervening to collect debts.
Making the U.S. the policeman of the Caribbean.
That's exactly what it meant. It led to the bad neighbor policy era with repeated U.S. military interventions, Dominican Republic, Cuba again, trying to impose order and protect U.S. interests.
Roosevelt was also involved in mediating the Russo-Japanese War.
He was. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, but the treaty actually angered both Russia and Japan, who felt they didn't get what they deserved.
Relations with Japan got tricky after that.
They did. There was the incident in San Francisco over segregating Japanese schoolchildren. That led to the Gentlemen's Agreement, where Japan agreed to limit emigration to the U.S.
And Roosevelt sent the Navy on a world tour, the Great White Fleet.
Yeah, classic big stick move, showing off American naval power. They also reached the Root-Takahira Agreement with Japan, basically agreeing to respect each other's possessions in the Pacific and keep the open door in China open. Though later, the Lansing-Ishii Agreement seemed to acknowledge Japan's special interests in China.
Then came President Taft and his dollar diplomacy.
A slight shift in emphasis. Taft wanted to use American investments abroad to increase political influence and use foreign policy to protect those investments. Less about the big stick, more about the almighty dollar.
How'd that work out?
Mixed results. The attempt to get involved in Manchurian railroads was a flop, but interventions in the Caribbean continued, often to protect American loans and businesses.
And even Woodrow Wilson, who came in sounding anti-imperialist.
Ended up intervening more in Latin America than Roosevelt or Taft. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, buying the Virgin Islands from Denmark, getting involved in the Mexican Revolution. Protecting U.S. interests remained paramount, regardless of the rhetoric.
So looking back at this whole period, 1890 to 1913, it's a massive transformation.
Absolutely. The U.S. goes from being largely inward-looking to having a global presence, an overseas empire, and a powerful Navy projecting force around the world.
Driven by economics, strategy, ideology, competition, all tangled together.
A really complex brew. The U.S. emerged much more powerful, much more respected by some, but also much more resented and feared by others, especially in its own hemisphere.
It certainly set the stage for the 20th century and America's rise to global superpower status.
Yeah.
But it leaves behind so many questions about power, responsibility, intervention. When you look at all this source material, what's the one thing that really sticks with you?
For me, it's just how interconnected everything was. You know, the end of the frontier wasn't just a line on a map. It created this anxiety that pushed people to look outward. Industrial growth created needs that seemed best met overseas. European actions created reactions. It really shows how domestic pressures and global ambitions feed off each other in powerful, sometimes unpredictable ways.
Yeah, that interplay is fascinating, and it definitely makes you think. So, for you listening, here's something to chew on. How does this era, this turn towards empire, still echo today? How do you see the legacies of American interventionism and global ambition playing out in the world right now? What questions does it raise for you about how nations act on the world stage?
Good questions to ponder.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.